Look, I started sitting in 1973, 74, something like that. So it's an awfully long time ago. And it's not as if I mean, it takes years and years and years. And then, I mean, it was only in 2005 that I was invited to teach. And so, yeah, how many decades is that? It's a lot of decades before I even started. And now it's sort of 2 decades after that. So when you ask what it's like, it's not something sudden. It's sort of like asking, what's it like changing from being a child to being an adult? You don't notice in the end. It's a sort of just such a long, slow process. And I think, you absorb the language of the practice and the way of doing things. It just happens gradually without one noticing, really. I mean, that was how it was for me. So there hasn't been a sort of shift. And now doing dokusan, I mean, it's a change when you first start offering dokusan to people. But, after a while, especially doing it in sesshin, because that's where you're doing it more or less all day, it just becomes
Familiar and easier.
what you have to do.
Yeah. Does it kind of excite you, or does it feel kind of in a way comforting if someone asks a question that you remember asking at some point along the way?
I mean, the we work with koans, in our tradition. So a lot of the, I mean, I do think that one of the things that's interesting about it is that, often students will respond to a koan in a way that I might have responded in the past wrongly. um, and that I think that's helpful. Um, for to know that it is difficult, it's a struggle, and to acknowledge that, that struggle. I mean, it never stops in a sense. I mean, we're always learning and we're always getting things wrong. And I think it's important that we share that it's not a kind of, on a pedestal sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And there is that kind of I guess maybe from a developing stage perspective that, oh, I want to have the right hold on this koan. And the koan practice isn't something that I've dabbled in myself, but I've read accounts of it. I've read notes of exchanges and things like that. And I'm like, okay, what's being said here, and how do I grasp this, and how do I do this and that? And so there's this expectation, or a want, or to have mastered something, or to have got the approval, so to speak, of a correct answer. And yet, I mean, does it feel like a koan could be? It's not so much the answer that's given or the understanding that can be written down or universally shared, so much as it is the answer being communicated to the point where it's the koan is understood by the person talking about it.
You never understand the koan. I mean, it's not an intellectual exercise in that way. Um, and, basically, I mean, perhaps if I just go back a little bit with this, I mean, our tradition, um, which the Diamond Sangha tradition, which, um, as you know, is sort of developed from the Sambo Kyodan originally, where Robert Aitken Roshi practiced with um, Yamada Roshi and other Japanese teachers. Um, and it's a tradition that includes both the Soto and the Rinzai tradition. Um, so it's neither one thing nor the other exclusively. So some people don't work with koans, but most people do. But the first, I mean, you will have a first koan, and very often that will be the koan mu, which is the first case in the woman guans, you know. But you don't go on to the other koans until you've had some sort of experience that enables you to respond to the first koan. And so it's not an intellectual exercise with right answers in that, in the way that, I don't know, maths or something is, you know. I mean, it's different, and it's not about, in a sense, it's thinking doesn't help at some level, you know, and it's not a case of mm, it's not a case of right or wrong in the way that we think of in intellectual sort of arguments and things. It's slightly different.
And when you approach something like that, because there's a part of me that thinks that this more open, well, I don't know if it's necessarily open, but like it's not something that's in a direct binary, right? Where like 2 + 2 = 4 does not
Yeah.
equal 5 or something like that. Whereas when you're working with koan, it's not necessarily that same kind of strict binary that is more or less universally shared. Do you find something particularly enriching or fulfilling about koan practice, especially I mean, I guess like from the beginning, from your early entry into the Diamond Sangha, or have you kind of, or have you developed some sort of greater appreciation for them now that you're in the more of the teaching role?
Hmm. You know, right from the very beginning, when I started in this particular tradition, because it wasn't where I started. I mean, my very first experience of sitting zazen was in a session with was in Northumberland, and it was the tradition of Kenneth Roshi, and that was quite different from the when I went. It was when I was in Japan, and I started with Yamada Roshi in Japan, but koans were just always there. I mean, there was always a teisho in any zazen kai or in sesshin. So you start to hear the stories. And it's a bit like hearing the family stories. I mean, I remember talking to my older brother a few years ago, just before he died, actually. And I was talking to him about things about our grandparents and great grandparents and great uncles and aunts. And he said, "How do you know all that?" And I said, "Well, Mum used to tell me the stories." And I mean, I never wrote them down or anything. I just knew in my bones, I knew the stories. And that's how it was with the koan stories. And that's how you sort of work with them. They're stories that you hear again and again, and you hear different shows on them. And it's not as if you understand them in some sort of intellectual way or anything. It's more that they start to resonate or something eventually, or they don't. You know, there's still some that, you know.
Yeah,
um,
that flow through you, and yeah, well, that's a really wonderful way of understanding their function or what they can do, where it's like a family story, and it's kind of carried through a lineage, or it's carried through just sitting and being in the environment among teachings and the principles of Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. They're just kind of ingrained in more, some might have more of an effect or take, a little bit more significantly than others. But that family story element is, yeah, because it's like for those kind of legendary or passed down stories, you more or less probably were not a part of those stories, right? And you weren't
mm,
like an active protagonist or anyone else in
yeah.
there, and yet it's a part of your life, it's a part of your story, and you won't and those are kind of woven into you to some degree.
Mm,
And there isn't like a necessarily a qualifier unless it's a, I don't know, particularly shameful or exciting story. I don't know, but like, it's a
mm,
part of the history of your life. Uh,
Yeah.
and yeah, so what was, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, but they can sort of resonate because many stories, I think, are instantly recognizable as having sort of meaning, if you like, that resonate with so many people, even if you don't quite know why, you know,
Yeah.
you know. Uh,
And does that feeling kind of carry when a koan is being discussed? Does that kind of does it create some sort of bond or some sort of mutual understanding among you and your sangha in the immediate vicinity that are a part of that discussion?
well, we don't discuss koans. It's always a one-on-one thing, and people respond to, I mean, to each specific koan, and the responses are quite different,
Mhm.
and so on. I mean, it's actually quite hard to talk about koan work in a way because it's such a personal thing. And, I mean, in some cases, there are responses that are kind of there's no alternative, there's only one response to certain things. But in other cases, it's not like that. It's more like, there's a range of possible ways of responding because it's personal and it'll be different for every person.
Yeah.
So,
And I feel like that's reflective of the whole some of the principles of Buddhism that are, here we are, all beings on our way, walking our own paths, and allowing for the larger umbrella or the greater experience of everyone having their own individuality, coming together and experiencing something like that. And what was I was wondering about your experience with going to Japan and kind of taking that step to go there and to train in that way.
okay, well, perhaps we need to go back a little bit. Could I? Um, I I didn't sort of decide to go to Japan myself. um, I had been interested in Zen, from the time I was a kid to a certain extent, because I remember when I was about 10 or 11, uh, sitting in the back of a car, and my mother was talking to a school teacher of hers, who had been a school teacher when my mother was a child, and my mother was 40 when I was born. So it was a long time ago that she'd been in school, and this elderly lady was there. And my mother said to her, she was telling my mother that her nephew was visiting. He's a Zen Buddhist, she said. And my mother said, "Oh, what's a Zen Buddhist?" And well, I don't know. Well, what does he do? Said my mother. Well, he just sits there looking at the wall. And I thought this was the most interesting conversation I had ever heard. Why would somebody sit looking at a wall? And I was always slightly interested in Zen as a result of hearing that conversation. And so I did a little bit of exploring during my school days. I read books about comparative religion, got into quite a bit of trouble at my Christian school for that, but um, for saying, "Have you got any more books on Buddhism?" And it's like, you've missed the point. You were supposed to realize something else. um, and then I went to study anthropology and linguistics at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And when I was there, I met somebody who was there studying Indian music, and he subsequently became my husband. But he then went on to study Chinese music at Cambridge and then had a postdoctoral research fellowship to go to Japan to do some more work on the Tang Dynasty music. So that was just about the time that I graduated, and we went to Japan then. But to be honest, I didn't go to Japan because I wanted to study Zen. I went to Japan because I was married to a man who was going to study there. So we had done some Zen. He was also interested in Zen, so we had been and done this retreat in a session in Northumberland, and he'd continued with Zen, but actually I had continued with quite a serious yoga practice for a few years rather than Zen. But when we got to Japan, it was difficult. We were living in a small fishing village in the first instance. I didn't know anyone. I didn't speak the language. He did, but he was out all day working. And I was lonely and I couldn't talk to anybody. And I was looking for work, but I hadn't got any at that stage. And it was just hard. And we went to various temples in the area. I mean, we were living not far from Kamakura, and there were some big Zen temples in Kita Kamakura and things, you know. So we did go and sit in some of the major sort of temples, but it was difficult, and it was just, you know, you're allowed to go on Saturday nights, but there was no teaching in English or anything, so we weren't getting very far. And then my husband Alan, who is actually also teaches Zen now, actually, but he heard from somebody at the language school about Yamada Roshi's place and how Yamada Roshi taught in English, and that there were lots of foreigners from Germany and the United States and everywhere who were going there to sit. And so that's when we started going. Well, we started going to Yamada Roshi's place, and he gave talks in English, and you know, there would be, you know, encouragement talks or shows. And I asked if I could talk to him, and the answer came back no, and it was such classic, you know. And then a few days later, I was delivered a yellow envelope with a whole lot of talks in it that he'd written. And I read them and I thought, this man can read my mind. It was as if every question about life and difficulty and everything was answered by these talks. And it was amazing, you know. I mean, now I understand that actually most people have the same sorts of problems. We experience, I mean, the details are different, but you know, what we grapple with as human beings
Yeah.
is pretty much the same for everybody. And this is what I realized that the practice deals with, how to be human in a way.
Wow.
Um,
It's such a, I mean, it's a wonderful story, and it can be quite amusing and comical at times too, because here you are following uh your husband's travels into Japan, and there you are feeling isolated and lonely. You're in a fishing village, you're way out, you know, you don't know the language, you're trying to get a job and nothing's really sticking. You finally find a community of English speaking Sangha, and with a Zen priest that is communicating in that way, and you're like, great, can I talk to him? It's like, no. No, you may not. And yet, you know, and then I don't know what your initial reaction to that was. I mean, probably a good healthy dose of rejection, and you know, sense of you know, what's the deal? And then you know, a couple days later, you receive all the things that you probably would have asked,
mm,
and that would have taken so much time. I think, you know, maybe you would have asked one question to the Roshi, and then that you know, but like, wait, can I have another minute? Can I wait? I have all these other ones. So there's this kind of more concise communication that happened when you had a chance to really absorb and read everything. And how thoughtful. I mean, you know, it wasn't the most gentle way of giving you that information, but at the same rate, it did end up in your hands. And I'm so glad that that experience helped not just position the teachings of Zen for you, but it also just helped position your sense of self in relation to humanity. I mean, that's a pretty profound experience that you had. It feels like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether I kind of articulated all that to myself at the time, but sort of, I, um, yeah. But I remember just being blown away by I mean, at the time, what I just thought was, he can read my mind, and he's never even spoken to me. That's what it felt like.
Wow.
And and then and then subsequently, we moved into a house in Kamakura, um, where there were other people, students of Yamada Roshi, were also living, and I mean, there were different sections of the house and things. So after that, I mean, it was a very regular practice to go and sit there at Yamada Roshi's dojo in the evenings, and there were talks, and I did a couple of sessions while I was there. Yeah.
Wow. And what were your first sashimi experiences like? I mean, was it pretty uh kind of intense considering your past yoga and past maybe sitting experiences before, or was it kind of this seamless experience?
Um, well, I mean, it was really interesting. I mean, we were, before we could do session, we had to, before we could do dokusan for the first time with Yamada Roshi, we had to do the orientation, which was taught by Miyazaki-san on Sunday afternoons. And we'd go there and we'd have to sit in Seiza for 3 hours without moving. Um, so, it was kind of physically intense. And yes, the yoga helped. um, but it was also, it felt, we were young. I mean, and you did that sort of thing in those days. Um, and then after going through what seemed like a sort of initiation process, then you'd go and do your first dokusan with Yamada Roshi and so on. So, and then that would take about 3 seconds or something. um, and I mean, there would be lots and lots and lots of people, foreigners as well as lots of Japanese people going there. So
Wow.
you
So
just,
yeah, 3 seconds you'd walk in and just kind of say, "I'm working on this," and Roshi would say, keep working on it," and then you'd be on your way, or was it something?
yeah, yeah. What is moo? Don't know. Ding ling 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 ling.
Wow.
I mean, I think it must have been a bit more than that in the first instance, because he would establish what you wanted from your practice, before, because I mean, not everybody was working with a koan, but um, you know, uh, that would all have happened in the sort of the first dokusan or something, and then you'd have your particular practice, and that would be what you do.
And were you doing that for some time? Like that living situation, were you in that community for a while? And then also where did you go next, and if it was influenced by your experiences in that community?
Okay, well, you see, the wonderful thing was that while we were there, and that was probably from about December, November, December through until about August, we were there in Kamakura, and then we had to go back to the UK. Um, but while we were there, we met Robert Aitken, who was not then yet a Roshi. He became a Roshi very shortly afterwards, but he hadn't been. Um, he was just Bob at that stage. And we met him, but I mean, everyone knew that he was sort of on the verge of becoming a Roshi. And and so we did get to meet him and things in Kamakura. And then what happened was that we went back to the UK, and that was probably September 1977, something like 1977. And then my husband, Alan, uh, got was offered a job in Sydney. He was a New Zealander, you see. He'd come to the UK from New Zealand, and I was there. But he was offered a job in Sydney Uni, and so in the following February, we moved to Sydney. And when we got to Sydney, we tried to find out about Zen groups, and there was a Sydney Zen group which was starting. And I mean, I don't think we found out about it immediately because I was just about to have a baby. There was a lot of other stuff going on, but sort of subsequently over the course of the next year or so, we found out a bit about the Sydney Zen Centre, and that Aitken Roshi had just accepted an invitation to come to Australia to teach. And he came once a year from then on, and he taught in Sydney and also in Perth. So he would come and do session one side of the country and session on the other side of the country. I'm not sure if he did them in Perth right from the start, but subsequently he did go to Perth sometimes. Anyway, it was just amazing because it was the tradition that we were in, and it was coming to us in Australia, so there wasn't any question about what's going on in Zen. Do we want to try this or that? It was just, well, this is obviously the path. I mean, that was how I felt about it. It was,
Yeah. And it this whole experience spans the globe. I mean, there you were,
mm,
based in the UK, you went to Japan, you had these interactions, you met Aitken Roshi, and then you moved to Sydney, and you're like, well, I guess, let's try this, while I have this kid, let's try to reintegrate. And then it's like, oh, he's coming. He's
yeah,
he's coming right here.
yeah,
And it's not just another Zen person, from another community or another tradition. It's like it's from that same very community that you were involved with.
yeah, yeah.
I'm so glad that you had that experience, uh and yeah, how amazing the timing. And so what was the blossoming of your Zen experience like in Sydney? And was there a lot of uh trying to replicate what was going on within the experience that you had in Kamakura? Or was it kind of, well, we have a chance now to build something that is similar to what Aiken Roshi is doing in Hawaii, and we can kind of make that happen here?
Look, it turned out that there were quite a lot of people in Sydney who had been sitting together anyway, and several of them had been to Hawaii and sat with Aitken Roshi there. So there were people who were much more experienced sitters than I was at that stage, and who and certainly had more experience working with Aitken Roshi than we had. And also, to be honest, at that time I was dealing with being a new mum in a new country, and you know, um, I would go to session, but I wasn't. I I didn't contribute a lot to the beginning of that group in the way that some of the other people who are now very good friends of mine, who I've known for over 40 years. But I mean, I just want to acknowledge that it was a whole lot of other people who put in a huge amount of work that made that Sangha happen. Um, and it was a very sort of community building experience in that one of the people in the group um, had a house that we were able to rent to as a dojo in Sydney. And also we actually built, when I say we, I mean the people in the group built a, a temple, basically a dojo. Well, it was a little cottage to begin with. It's now grown into something bigger, but out of Sydney, 2 or 3 hours drive out of Sydney, in a place that's actually quite difficult to get to because of the need to cross streams and so on to get to it. But that's a wonderful place now that people practice in. So, but it took years and years and years for the place to grow and build and so on. Yeah, so
Yeah, that's
it was
wonderful.
I mean, this is something that, I mean, there were bumps along the way, I mean, but it's something that now, after 40 years, more than 40 years, has become a very strong group. And that's the Sydney Zen group, which, of course, I was part of for a while, but then at a certain point, I moved to Perth. So
Mm-hmm.
th which is where I now teach. So,
And you, what, and do you sometimes like go back to Sydney, or are you mostly located in Perth, and then you also go to do work with the Zen group of Western Australia as well?
well, Perth, I mean, the Zen group of Western Australia is in Perth.
I gotcha.
So,
Okay.
look, basically, I need to fill you in now on how that happened. I mean, I sat with the Sydney Zen group for, from the early 80s through until sort of about 1992, 1993. But in 1992, my marriage had broken down and I went to live in Perth because for personal reasons, I'd moved to Perth at that stage. And that's when I started sitting with the Zen group of Western Australia. And Ross Bollitter was teaching there. So I practiced with him in the Zen group of Western Australia from then on. I would go back to Sydney sometimes for session too, but I was basically based there. But I had sat session for many years with Aitken Roshi to begin with, and subsequently when he was getting older, and John Tarrant came for a while to Sydney and to Perth as well. So this was over decades.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
That's
I mean it. Yeah, so I'd worked with Yamada Roshi, and then actually Alan and I went back to Japan in 1983 and took the children. So I also sat with Yamada Roshi again in the 1980s, and by that stage I was working on koans, and so I worked with Yamada Roshi on koans. I hadn't been working with koans earlier, so.
oh.
But it was a very, very slow process, I mean, and I wasn't trying to, I mean, it was just my practice. I didn't have any, I didn't have any ambition to be a Zen teacher. I can assure you. It's sort of, I mean, I was just staying alive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that
Mm,
you were doing it as practice, and yeah, you had your hands full. I think you had
mm.
quite a few things going on, and that's actually something that I wanted to get into, because I remember reading about how you would sometimes bring your family, or bring your kids along for some temple visits, or for some temple activity. It sounds like, or at the very least, you were and are like a parent that was balancing that life and also doing your practice and fulfilling your Zen practice. And I wanted to know how that influenced your work with Everyday Zen, and like, I believe it's called the Life Works, that you were working on, where you were trying, or Life
Oh,
Work. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Right. Well, going back to the beginning, I mean, I had a baby soon after I arrived in Australia, and then I had another one. And so in those early years when Aitken Roshi used to come out from Hawaii every year to do a session, um, he would accommodate people who had children, and we would take our children to session, take our babies to session. It wasn't just me, it was another family at that stage who also had two children. And the parents would take it in turns, so that, if I did the early morning block of sitting, my husband would look after the kids until after breakfast, and then I'd do the next block of sitting. So we do turn and turn about, and the other families would do the same thing, so that one parent would look after the children while, block about. And then gradually we moved to that was before we built the building out in Gorrick's Run, and after that, um, people would camp there in tents, and there'd be children in tents, and more people went and took children, and it became a communal thing of somebody, maybe a couple of people would look after the children for the whole morning, while all the parents, or most of the parents, could go and sit. you know. So it was always part of the Sydney Zen Centre experience that people were able to take their children to session, and that happened for many years, and now those children have grown up, and those children have had children themselves and things. So, and we all still keep in touch. I mean, even though I'm no longer actually part of the Sydney Zen Centre, because I'm the Zen Centre of WA is my Sangha now. I still am involved in a lot of their more social activities and and so on. And so, they're my friends.
Yeah.
We stay friends after 40 years of sitting together.
Yeah.
Um, and in Perth, it was a little bit different. They didn't take children to session there. I discovered it was obviously a Sydney thing. And I think it was a matter of accident that there were quite a few couples where both parents sat in Sydney, which meant that we had to sort out the children issue somehow. And that's how we did it. And Aitken Roshi was the other thing I should say is that Aitken Roshi was very welcoming of children and things. So we would always, there'd be session, but, children were welcome at session, as I've just explained, but, there'd be other experiences and, baby naming ceremonies and things like that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a very family friendly Sangha in Sydney.
And we had talked about that before, about how the Diamond Sangha is a lay Sangha, and I guess that's the lay life is kind of interwoven, and there's an understanding and an embrace of the everyday sense of everyone's experiences into services, into session, and into the very interactions and engagements that happen within the Diamond Sangha community. And that's kind of something that you have carried into some of your programs that you run for session, where it is like under the umbrella of an everyday Zen um I guess topic or whatever it is, where like that's kind of like a theme that runs throughout, where you create opportunities to let people that work a full day to take some time in the evenings to engage, and then do some things over the weekends or something like that, right? To help make sure that they get their chance to sit.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, what happened was that, we until very recently I was working full time. And so was most other people who were sitting in the Zen group, and people, I think, when we started, it's something I thought about, in the 70s and in the 80s, it seemed to be much easier to sort of work for a bit and then not work and then get a job again easily and things. But things have tightened up a lot more now. It's you can't just think, oh well, I'll go off for 3 months and do some Zen and then come back and find a job. It's tighter. So it seemed that, and it's hard for people to get a lot of time off to do lots of session and things as well. So um, my plan with uh, I started Everyday Zen. This was something that happened in about 2016, I think, was the first one I did. And that was after I was given permission to teach in 2005, but I was very busy working at that stage. And anyway, the main thing was that it was quite difficult for me to teach very much immediately afterwards during that period. But subsequently, when I was uh, free to do so, and I Ross Boliter invited me to do some teaching with the Zen group of Western Australia, and I did that, and I had transmission. And after that, I would always teach session, the main 7-day big session with Ross. But I was living in Indonesia at the time, so I just fly across from Jakarta to per session. But once I moved back to Australia, I wanted to do some more teaching, and I introduced everyday Zen as a way. I mean, we called it a training period to begin with. It was, the idea was to get some more chance to do some more extended Zen practice. And then it became known as everyday Zen, because the whole idea was that we could do something that went for about 10 days, but people could still go to work, because people couldn't take off 2 weeks to do things, and they couldn't necessarily get, you know, I mean, it's expensive to hire a place and for people to pay for accommodation and all that sort of thing. So what we did was that we had an opportunity to do things where we do like a zazen all day, sitting on the Saturday and the Sunday over 2 weekends. But then on the Thursday evenings, which are normal sitting nights, we'd do normal sitting. And then on the Friday, we'd have a workshop, and then again on the Monday, and again on the following Friday, and also the Thursday. So it was a way of integrating our practice into life, which is why it was. And so I need to go back a little bit. I started doing something called life work in Sydney for a while, and that was sort of connected to the Sydney Zen Centre, but not exactly. But it was more like workshops to look at how our practice affects our lives. And I think it really struck me once, because I was giving a talk at the Sydney Zen Centre, and somebody was telling me that they, you know, asked about whether you're supposed to practice all the time. Well, yes. And this person was a lawyer, and he said, you know, and so you stick to the precept. And well, yes, he said, because when I go to the office, I'm really, he talked about being really inclusive and things with the staff and treating them well and things. And I said, yeah. And he said, but I can't be a lawyer. He said, am I supposed to do it all the time? Am I supposed to stick to the precepts even when I'm a lawyer? And I sort of said, well, perhaps you are, And it was just that idea of do we have a line? Do we say, okay, now here when I'm on my cushion, I'm going to try to, stick to my precepts and, not tell porkies and all that sort of thing, Whereas when I'm in my life, I do what I want, and if needs be, I'll do this, that, and the other. So it was just a way of exploring all that really drew me in. And how do we practice as lay people in our lives every day? And so now we do that so then I introduced that as something that I could do in Perth, and I thought I was doing it just a one-off thing, but now I've done it every year since 2016.
Wow.
So
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful program, and it's I believe you really take to that Hakuin saying. I'm trying to find where you have that, but basically it's like, a really important practice happens kind of in the midst of things, where
yes, in the midst of activity. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
How do you practice in the middle of our busy lives now?
yeah. And I mean, gosh, I could think of so many occasions for practice, like in the grocery store, where someone's taking forever to grab the canola beans or whatever it is, and it's just, you're kind of waiting there with your cart. But when you feel that kind of rush, or that stress, or that moment of maybe tension, however it's kind of manifesting, that can be a moment where you check in, where you recognize maybe the Buddha nature in somebody else in yourself, take a breath, maybe reconnect with something a little bit larger, increase the perspective or whatever it is, raise awareness, and bring that into that moment, because that's just as viable as a moment as it is when you're sitting in a formal position or whatever. And I'd imagine that when you were sitting with your growing family, changing out the guard, if you will, from being able to go and sit in a formal way for sesshin and then come back and watch the kids while partners kind of do a do-si-do, that you kind of bring maybe some of that attentiveness back into the kids and wrangling the kids in a certain way of compassion or with an increased level of awareness or something like that, when you're kind of maintaining the precepts as a parent.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's I was listening to you saying that, and I'm thinking, I think I could have done with, the experience that I've had now, um, back then when 45 years ago when my children were very young. Um, yeah, of course, it's a case of sort of, I mean, practice is practice, and the more you do it, it helps, but um, it doesn't make you into a sort of calm, saintly mother right at the beginning, I can assure you.
No, definitely not. No, definitely not. I have myself a toddler, and it's a lot of
Mm,
testing. It's a lot of tests of like, oh, really? You're on the path. I see. Okay, great. Well,
yeah,
how about
yeah,
a quick meltdown for you? How about, let's see how you take that.
yeah.
Um, and then as far as like the applicability or the way that you can ground yourself in practice in maybe less formal temple-based settings. I remember you'd mentioned that doing zazen on a boat in the Indian Ocean is a great place to do it. And I was curious about your experiences. I don't know if it was sailing or if it was a different type of boat, but you were doing.
No, it
Oh,
was sailing. It was
yeah.
sailing. Yeah. Um,
Wow.
my second husband and I bought a boat and sailed all around the Indian Ocean for 3 years. Um, and so, some of the voyages would be quite long, getting from, where do we go from Thailand across to Sri Lanka, for example. That was a long haul. Um, and so, obviously, when you're sailing, somebody has to be on watch all the time. And when there are two people, it means that you're on watch half the time. And I felt very lucky. I had the night watch from midnight till sunrise. And you can't read because you can't have lights on because you have to be looking out for lights elsewhere in the ocean and things. So basically you just sit on the deck and it's quite calm usually at night. I mean, obviously, if it's not calm, you're focusing on that rather than on just um, sitting. But a lot of the time I would just sit there, and it was just a wonderful place to sit because you'd be out in the best I mean, starry nights are perfect. There isn't any light pollution in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Um,
Wow.
and every morning, watch the morning star come up. Yeah. Mm.
Wow. I mean, what an
Happy.
incredible
Yeah.
experience. And yeah, too, that you have to deal with the choppy waves that are coming by every once in a while, or storms, or be on the lookout for whatever else, and just maintain the integrity of the ship. But there are also some times when you can have a moment to yourself with yourself under the stars. And I imagine there's not a whole lot around you when that happens, and you just have it's just for you to be there.
Yeah, I mean, most sailing is sort of hours and hours of nothing very much happening. And it's calm. The wind is blowing gently. The sea is calm. There's nothing around. Um, it's just that when there are moments of terror and panic, they are extreme. But most of the time, it's not like that.
Wow. Wow.
So
And I think you documented this experience in a book, Slow Travel. Is that right?
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what an amazing, because like when I had heard about the story, I was like, wow, this should be a book, and then it is. So I'm glad that
You have done your research, haven't you?
yes, yeah. No, it's incredible. And it's and you know, that's such a unique experience, especially from a I don't know how many other books there are about sailing and merging experiences with practice at the same time. So it's a very unique story. I'm just so glad that you went in depth on it, and that there is that there for you. And then I know we're kind of getting close to time, but I did want to ask about your experiences a as an academic studying Aboriginal languages, and like if there's any sort of um, tie to your Zen practice that you see, or if there are, these are in a healthy way their own kind of distinguished categories of experience.
I'm glad you asked that question because actually, I mean, it was very important um, to me. I mean, I was working with languages that, I mean, I was working with people whose languages were being lost. That's been my work all along with in Australia. I mean, and the I was very fortunate when I did my research for my PhD. It was looking at, I was living in a remote community where people were actually speaking Creole by that stage. Creole was um, the the language that was a sort of English-based language that was spoken by a lot of people who had spoken lots of different languages, but when they were all herded together, as it were, into during the war, people spoke um, the English-based Creole language. But as a consequence of that, I got to know people who lived more traditionally and so on. And I remember being out in the bush one day with a woman called Nellie Fu, who had grown up in until she was 14, she'd never seen a white person and lived a completely traditional life, um, hunting for food and swimming, I mean, washing in rivers and so on, living in humpies. And I remember her saying to me, you white fellas, you got no culture. And just that jazz and stuff. And I mean, when she said culture, I knew that I mean, there was song, but it wasn't about songs as entertainment. It was about song as having profound meaning, um, and a sort of, I mean, the dream time sort of, it's hard to talk about because there isn't the English words for it, but, sort of, um, the ancestors and how they lived and rules of living and all that sort of thing, a really deep, profound culture. And and I said, "Oh, well, no, but we've got Zen, And I sort of started to tell her about Zen because it seemed like the closest about the practice of of meditation and what it was about. And we were able to sort of communicate somehow through that. And she would speak about how, and the thing that was most profound for me was the fact that everything was interrelated. I mean, every person had their place in the family. You were related to everybody else in some way. Everyone belonged to one or other skin group, one of 8 skin groups, and you would have to marry person in that skin group and your children would be that skin group. And so every all people are interrelated, but also trees and animals and things are part of that system. And so I remember being out in the bush with her and we was there all day and she was saying, that's my grandfather, she said, pointing. People point with their lips. Uh, and it was a great big gnarly tree that was her grandfather. And it's that sense that everything, you are related to every living thing on the planet, you know, trees or animals or birds or fish or insects, everything is interrelated. And one of the things that I love about Zen, and I think it's partly, it's partly Buddhism, but it's also some influence when it becomes Chan of from Taoism and things, and the whole sort of interrel a very sort of earthy interrelatedness of everything. I mean, I'm not, of course, that extends throughout all forms of Buddhism, but it's sort of particularly potent, I think, sometimes in the early sort of Chan understanding, that we're all it, that nothing is excluded, and I felt that that was something that she and I were able to some extent to sort of um, understand about each other's way of looking at the world.
Wow. I mean, what a profound experience, and what a beautiful kind of connection, I guess, like where you both kind of come from a perspective of maybe understanding each other a little bit more through that experience, and seeing, bringing elements that are both meaningful to each other into a way that you can have a dialogue about interconnectedness and things like that. I mean, I don't know if this would be interesting for you as an academic or even just as a writer again, but I mean, this would be an excellent, also another book that would be terrific, and and uh and something that you know a thing or two about. So I would absolutely, if you're ever considering it, I would absolutely would love to read something like that. I mean, that is it's incredible, and uh yeah, well, and I'm happy to hear that there is that you've had these experiences where um you can share something like that and be out there, and yeah, that's really truly amazing. And have you also incorporated some of the culture, I guess I would say, because I don't want to parse it down into practice and ritual and things that are different than the lived experience of some Aboriginal people and individuals. But have you brought some of that culture into your perspective as you kind of walk in and move in the world? Have you noticed that your Zen or yourself has like a quality that is imbued with some of these approaches to life?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've always worked with, you know, um, I mean, I should also say that my first husband, who was working with the Japanese musics, when he came to Australia, he started working with Aboriginal music as well. So we were both living in remote communities and working um, for a few years. And I went on to sort of work with Aboriginal um, uh, supporting Aboriginal language activities in my job. I stopped being an academic and worked in the education department as a consultant for the education department for the Aboriginal languages program, and was incredibly fortunate to be able to go and work with and in Aboriginal communities all over New South Wales as part of that role. And finally, but I mean, there are tensions, as you're probably aware. um, we were, I mean, the fact that we didn't get the voice referendum up in Australia last year was incredibly disappointing for Aboriginal people, but also for many of us who have lived and worked with Aboriginal people a lot. And but before the voice happened, I mean, I was working for an Aboriginal community cooperative organisation who employed me to manage the sort of linguistic aspect of their language centre, and do all the applying for grants and all that sort of the difficult sort of bureaucratic stuff that had to be done for that, as part of that role. But I feel incredibly privileged to have actually worked for an Aboriginal community organisation who have and who would they were doing fantastic work. I mean, there was um, one particular woman I'm thinking of while I was there who had very much wanted to um, learn her own language. And somebody had put together a grammar of that language. And her mother had been really excited that this book had come out that had all the details about their language. But then when her mother saw the book, it was like a dictionary. It was the Hunter River Lake Macquarie language. And it it didn't help. You couldn't read that book and then know how to speak the language. So she wanted to write her own book um, on how to, a sort of introductory grammar to the language. And so while I was there, I was able to help organize that came about, that she was able to write her own book about it and that people could use. So, yeah, I mean, that's the interconnectedness and
Yeah. And
connection.
you help someone connect and further their connection to their culture and their heritage. And then that very book can help kind of serve as another bridge for other people that are looking to do the similar thing, and
Yeah.
keep sustain that for everyone else. Wow,
I
really.
mean,
Mhm.
well, I just wanted to say that, I mean, I feel as if I played a very small role in that, as with everything that ever happens in Aboriginal community organizations, they all depend on a lot of people working together to do it, so
Yeah.
um,
But thank you for your work and for being someone that helps facilitate and helps, in any way that you do, you help facilitate people being able to connect more with their cultures and shine a light on its importance, that people are able to do that. So that's a really wonderful thing. And I know we've come to a close now, but I had just two quick questions that are kind of a part of the same thing, which is one, like if you had anything that you'd want to promote, whether it's a cause or a foundation or a book that you think would be really helpful for anyone to read, and can draw some inspiration from. And also too, if you have any advice, this is an and or, you don't have to, but if you have any advice for someone that you would have wanted to have heard at any point along your path as you kind of move through it.
just see.
Hmm.
When it comes down to it, I mean, there are lots of books you can read and things, but nothing beats actually just putting yourself on a cushion and being, you know, uh, doing that. Now I had it written down so that I got the words right. Of a new koan that I came upon recently, and I found it quite interesting. It was someone asked Shao Shan, all sentient beings have the Buddha nature. Why don't they know it? And Shao Shan said, they know. And we do know. We just need to allow that knowing to emerge. And sitting is how you do that. So
That is it's a wonderful. I'm so glad that you came across that and shared that. Thank you very much. I do think that sometimes I get distracted with, making sure that my bookshelf is full of things that are inspiring and interesting and intellectually stimulating. But at the end of the day, it is about making that time for yourself and making that not necessarily effort, but allowing for yourself to know. So
yeah, and we do know. We just have to realize that we know. And that koan, I'll just tell you, it's in a sort of section of, I've had a copy of Cleary's translation of the Blue Cliff Record for decades, and I've read lots of it, but I had never read the bits that are the notes on the notes, at the back, and that's where I came across this koan suddenly, and it was just, yeah.
that's
So there's
perfect.
always something to learn.
Yeah, yeah, and looking again. taking another look at things. Well, Mary, thank you so much for speaking with me
Thank
today and
you.
for taking your time. This is such a wonderful conversation, and I feel very inspired, encouraged, and you've lived such a unique, to me, Zen experience, and I'm so glad that you've documented it, that you've talked about it, that you shared it, and that also too, I mean, just like there's so much more that you're giving to your community. So so thank you for sharing all the things that you know and that you've done. It really is, it's such a, there's so many details that are just so different. I mean, 3 years on a ship alone, that could be that can be, you know, an entire movie, entire that could launch someone's career. So it's just a really remarkable journey so far. So thank you for sharing
Yeah,
it.
but I've spent a lot more time just washing dishes and sweeping up.
Sometimes on a boat, you know, sometimes.
Yes.
But yeah, and that too, though, and that too, that is in
Yeah.
its own way a remarkable feat. But thank you so much for joining me today, and yeah, I look forward to hearing about all the things to come, and hope to connect again soon.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.